everybody. I'm Freddie Quack, Chair of the BCS Digital Divide Specialist Group. Delighted to host this webinar today, which is going to be covering the topic of closing the digital divide, fighting loneliness and digital equity. This specialist group is one of the strategic priorities within the BCS, and our mission is to leave no one digitally behind. Now, this is a huge topic. There are many dimensions to this, and one of the things that we thought we could help with is to socialize what everybody needs to understand about the sort of landscape of digital inclusion, exclusion, poverty, divide, whatever terms you use. It's not an easy thing to understand, but hopefully through this series, we will all learn a little bit more than what we have known, and I have definitely learned a lot. Just to give you some insights and context, in the past year, we've only been around for a year. We've had topics covering dementia, covering sort of autism, covering what sort of local communities in Staffordshire is doing, covering homelessness, and today we are going to be talking about this hugely important topic of loneliness, because this is something that affects all of us from time to time. Some people are more permanent than others. So let me sort of say a few words about our presenter today. Please welcome Tim Leach, CEO of Wavelength Charity. He will tell us a lot more about this charity, but this is a charity which has been combating loneliness among vulnerable and isolated people through technology. I came across Tim a couple of years ago. I noticed a number of familiar names here. One of them is Leela. Leela, thank you. You're one of the ones that we have that mutual connection with Tim. And I am sort of surprised and shocked to find out that this has been a charity that's been around for a long time, right? I'm going to let Tim tell you a bit more in a moment. But Tim, in his background, he's initiated the first ever research into the impact of technology in helping to manage and mitigate loneliness, improving health outcomes, happiness, and benefiting social and economic factors. He has headed up Wavelength since 2006, so he's been doing this for a long time. And he's sort of overseen a lot of work in challenging the root causes of loneliness and isolation. He's also the founder and chair of this digital equality group, which helps government, regulatory bodies, manufacturers, data providers to make sure that all services, communications, and technologies are provided on an equal and accessible basis. So I'm really delighted that Tim is going to tell us not just about one thing that he knows very well, which is about loneliness, but he's also trying to help us to understand what is this thing called digital equity. So Tim, over to you.
There you go. There's a rookie mistake. Muted myself. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to meet you all. Nice to see familiar names. It guilts me that I have not caught up with Leela for a very long time. However, I'm going to start on the presentation, and hopefully, if I share my screen, you'll be able to see this. And I'm going to run you through what the Wavelength does and where we've come from, really. So Wavelength is over 85 years old. We're founded before the Second World War. You're very welcome to have my contact details and get in touch with me. And this will really, hopefully, give you a way of asking questions later on, or something pops into your mind. So we were founded to combat loneliness, partly by the BBC and the Rotary Club was in London. We're a national organisation throughout the UK. We work with partner organisations, and we give individual grants of technology, which is simple, off-the-shelf technology, nothing special, nothing complicated, which can be a television or a radio, or it can be a tablet, a laptop. And we do a few other things as well. We also provide data at the moment through through Vodafone, who have provided SIM cards. I'm going to try and give you an overview of loneliness within the UK in terms of how the landscape lies. there have been lots of people who started to come into this field. And I imagine a lot of you are from the technology side. And I'm very aware of that. So I sort of work in a technology area, but I see technology as an overall thing, and I'm interested in people's relationship with it. One of the things I would say is I've seen the loneliness types and scales change, and I've been very much central to helping people like ONS, the Office of National Statistics, define loneliness, decide what scaling they're going to use and how that's measured on an ongoing basis through the family survey. And that longitudinal, very broad bit of work the ONS does then is matched with the work we do, where all our grants are monitored and use the same scaling, the London scale of loneliness, which asks 4 basic questions and a health question. And the health question was put there because I knew there was an impact of loneliness on health. And I started this work probably about 15 years ago. I had this independently done by the University of York, and then I've had other universities come in and pick up the research. So none of my stuff is just the publicity put out by other charities about what they found through their user groups in terms of the impact of loneliness on the sort of 20 people that have been surveyed. I've done this on mass, and I've done it for a long time. So I can tell you how these things have changed over the COVID period, what's happening now, etc., and what the impact of certain technologies are. So basically, in terms of types of loneliness, I would say we have got a low, medium, high, and then an endemic. And the endemic is usually something where somebody is cradle to birth. It's a very interesting state. It's probably very much underlies many of the mental health states. We understand anxiety as a trigger to a lot of mental health issues. However, loneliness is probably a wider base and probably more important. And then we have loneliness, which is triggered. And what's interesting to me is when I look at what we do, which is provide pieces of technology, when we measure that impact, we can actually see, we can mitigate loneliness. We can't get rid of it, but we can lower the impact, particularly in the endemic group and particularly in the higher group. Our impacts are higher. And that means we're saving UK PLC a lot of money where it comes to health services, social services, and other interventions which are out there. So we are sort of then fight with this idea that technology is a bad thing, which seems to be more to do with our historic and almost Luddite perception of technology. When something first arrives, we don't particularly like it. Well, they're going to smash it up and don't want anything to do with it. You can see this with radio was blamed for all the evils of the world, the corruption of the young, down to bad skin and weather, to people absolutely adoring it, not wanting to be without it, and it couldn't do any wrong at all. And you see TV has sort of gone through that phase as well, whilst the internet and what's happening within that sort of World Wide Web sphere is starting to change. I've picked out, because I think it's very important when we start talking about where people are and the people we work with, while there might be some underlying difficulties in terms of what we're doing and what our approaches are. So I've always been one of the people who said what people need is equipment, and they need to be able to have access. Because a lot of the people I work with don't have the money to get that. And I can tell you one of the key bits of data which came out of the pandemic period was that loneliness for the first time started to be related geographically and to economic indicators. And that was the first time that has ever happened. At the same time, it seemed to be related to younger people. And it seemed to be the people who were affected by not having contact, which we would normally have. so people from school age into university. And then here's a key factor which came out of some of the Ofcom surveys on what they do over communication, was that younger people were struggling in terms of how much they were spending on their connectivity, and different areas couldn't spend enough on their connectivity. And those areas are linked, and therefore data poverty to me is a key issue, and the ability to afford that data is. So, you know, one of the things I've campaigned for largely is that every home should be connected. Into the logic in that, it should be a minimum standard of broadband, and it should be one which people can use, and it's something which should be there and supported, and then we can build on top of it if we want to. One of my warnings is that we have gone down perhaps the wrong track in terms of where we are with people, and some of that I think you've got to look very deeply at why we've done that. So we've seemed to have thrown a lot of money down the black hole of training, and that's going to be a rather controversial statement to many, but I would say there are reasons for this. And one is we are having difficulty getting people online. A lot of the people I work with, I know, have neurodiversity, cognitive processing problems, which are both visual and auditory. You've had talks upon autism, I understand. You also will have them on dementia. And you look at these groups, and I can say, well, if you just look at dyslexia, which really has issues online because everything's been turned into text, you're looking at 10% of the UK population. You look at the crossover and the amount which you probably have with neurodiversity, you're probably looking at 30% of our UK population. If you then think about the amount of people not really going online, very well matches up. So why have they been left out? Why aren't we accommodating them? What's happening there? Well, I would put it down to things like the older people and disabled disability surveys, which are done by Ofcom, which then are used for policy making. And if you look at those, very clearly, this group of people are missed out. And that means the impact of then taking that survey to the Department of Education, who then have a big influence upon what we should be delivering, comes out in our policy. So we need to fix the basic information we are working from. I'll give you some examples of things we've done as well in terms of how we're starting to use technology to combat loneliness. And I said we worked with both individuals and groups, and one of the things we did was to help individuals network and communicate together. And one of those things we did was a hybrid service, really, in terms of taking groups which are already working together, bringing individuals into them. And we did this with a Netflix film club, which Netflix sponsored for, I think it was a year and a half, and gave out equipment and allowed people to come together and communicate. And that helped people have an element where they could cross over culturally, an element in their life which they could look forward to, an element in their life which they could share with in terms of watching a film, but also coming back and talking about that with other people and analysing it. And that group has gone on and kept in contact and kept in being supported. But what it did was take a concept which has been there for a long time out into the real world. And that's helped people start to bond together. I've forgotten to start my timer. And I think what was important about that was it, for the first time, it actually was making real life connections, and it was getting people external from their homes out into the world. It wasn't what many people see as the issue about technology, cocooning them inside and holding them prisoner, which is the traditional way of seeing what online relationships are. I also would say it's not like phone befriending, which tends to be a proxy friendship. And those befriending networks often fail after about three years. And it's because of proxy nature, I believe those are not happening. So we look to network people together. We look to take the guidance of the organisations we work across the UK with, and we look to have them supported and accommodated rather than trained. I put the radio in just to remind people that digital is not just about being online. It will encompass the World Wide Web, everything. You know, it will be our toasters, it will be our freezers, it will be our fridges ordering a loaf of bread because the toaster says it doesn't have anything to put into it. And I explain this to my staff. It's a bit like everybody in their homes becoming a CEO, finding out the staff are doing things they definitely don't want happening, and your lives are going to be hell, quite frankly. So you need to sort of move on and think, how are you going to manage that situation? And behind that, I'm very aware that we've got big black holes in our legislation, mainly because all the people who should be concentrating on this were diverted by Brexit, were diverted by, you know, power struggles over COVID and number 10, and just all that stuff we really didn't need, which is really why I think it's communities of our own which need to come together to solve these problems. And that's why the work that Freddie was doing around Join the Dots was so attractive to me, and why I said I needed to be involved in that. An example of where things can go wrong, we ran a very successful project around care homes during the COVID period, putting tablets out there, making sure they were available. We checked that the staff were able to take these on, they had connectivity, they had the ability to cope with, you know, relative residents, as well as the COVID lockdown situation and the tablets. BT sponsored another organisation which will remain nameless to provide tablets into care homes in Wales. They didn't bother to ask any questions, only something like 30% of those tablets ever got used. That was then blamed on the fact that care homes didn't have any training. It wasn't about care homes having training, it's about the care homes actually having connectivity, the member of staff who could actually utilise the device and have the time to do it under such circumstances which were going on. Plus, what we had done is made sure we had an external organisation which already had a pre-existing relationship. So those community relationships we navigate through, and the ones that know what's happening on the ground, we take guidance off. We help them with a model or sets of models where you can use basic equipment in the way they want to use it. So we're never rubber stamping an answer on people, we're making sure it fits the purpose on the ground. So I'm still left with a lot of people who can't use equipment. And I talking to everybody today, I would imagine there are a lot of you who have different ideas about the language which is used within the sphere of loneliness, and also within the sphere of digital technology, digital equality, you know, getting people online. It's always been talked about. And I do run something called a digital equality group, which was, as Freddie has pointed out, is try and bring a little bit of control back into that for people who actually can't get online, to make sure that non-digital or analog services are still available, because actually what's happening is they're being taken away. And I think I would have called it digital equity group rather than equality group. The more I find that language is being reappropriated by people who just wanted to match what they're doing to tick a box. And I felt this was the best way I could try and get over the difference between equality and equity. I kind of see equity as giving people what they need so they can participate, whilst I see equality as just a level playing field and not really solving the issues of many or bringing people to where they need to be. And I think that's why I'm far keener that I talk about, you know, supporting people rather than training them, about making services accessible in the way they want to and they need. This is my grumble section, my rant time. And within this, I think it's important to confess, I'm actually severely dyslexic. And I still find that a position where I find getting accommodation for that is difficult. And what I've put up is some examples of things which are my pet hates. People telling me that worldwide accessibility standards for the web make things accessible for me. They don't. They absolutely don't. They pretty well major upon people who are blind, partially sighted, have other sensory impairments, who are deaf. They also look at people who have physical impairments as well. I'm not saying that shouldn't be the case, but we have difficulties getting through to people. The delays on phone lines, which we're getting because of digitalization of phone signals, have made things particularly difficult. If people have an auditory processing difficulty, it means people talk over them. The advent of chatbots, both on phone lines and within the accessing of services when you just want a phone number to talk to a human being, just winds me up amazingly. I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds these difficult, but I've also put up on purpose to lots of banking logons. I have a difficulty really in terms of the way these are constructed, the way that colour is used to guide me through this process, and the way that language is used in very different manners. So, for example, on HSBC, I'm asked to enter my username. Well, it's not a username. I know it's an email address. This lack of foresight that this may be very misleading is not helpful. I also have on Barclays, you know, a membership number of 12 digits. Well, I know that number on Barclays is not just a number, it also contains letters. So all these things provide difficulty, and the next thing which then comes into it is the advent of, you know, second tier identification. Well, lots of people don't have access to that. They find it difficult getting online, never mind having a smartphone or a tablet or another email address something could be sent to. Or they're struggling with the internet connectivity. So all these things are really, really interesting ways of doing it. But it frustrates the hell out of me when there's voice recognition, there's face recognition, fingerprint recognition, all of which are very individualized. Yes, they can be put onto a device and lost, and banks don't want to hold that data on you because there's a whole series of problems in terms of holding that data, where it's held, whether it's in the UK, whether it's nationally. But it could make life a lot easier for lots of people. My ability to misspell things as well, in terms of, I hate sending emails because of having to write the email address in. The amount of times I used text to speech out of desperation rather than having my PA with me and it going wrong because I can't read the words which are spelled correctly but are a load of garbage, and sometimes can be very insulting, particularly if it's decided to put pubic rather than public when I'm trying to get some sort of service out of somebody. tends to lead to embarrassing situations for me. So those are just a few of the items which I sort of think we fall into. Some of the ways that these questions are always posed to me are that, you know, so Tim, you've got all these grumbles, but so what's missing? And what do you mean? What can we do about it? Well, the people I work with more than anything, the equipment we provides a window on the world. The data is their connectivity, is their contact, is their comfort, is their communication mechanism. The support, the mentoring, the doing of things is really important. To be able to get that, you need the other sides. You need the actual equipment. You need the data and there. And I believe we're talking about equity rather than equality. So if those services are not available in a non-digital way, they should be, and we need to preserve them, because the digital world will not work without the analog. It doesn't work without it being human, having human intervention. So we need to make sure it's built in. And the reason I also pick banks is that banks are now finding they have huge problems because they've gone online and cut the services. So much so, they're now trying to re-establish groups which actually can help people get online. Unfortunately, rather than supporting them through the process, they've decided they will have people who go out and do training. And I think that's really problematic. So a lot of these things about income inequalities and, you know, disabled people who I'm really talking about and covering here in the majority, and older people as well, income inequalities are key. They are less likely to have access to income, well-paid jobs, and therefore good educations. And all those things are factors within how people become isolated and not able to interact in the world. And if we don't make those things as user-friendly as possible and interfaces we can have people navigate through, or have the guidance and support to navigate them through that in the way they want, in the way they need, we're not going to get anywhere. So I would also like to point out, when I'm talking about equipment, I'm not talking about end-of-life equipment which may have been donated, which is going to be difficult to use, or just 6 months of data. It needs to be something which will accommodate people, or a training program which only lasts for the next update of your Microsoft Windows or your Mac pages, because people need to be always able to find a way around. And the one thing I know about using these programs is the language changes, the layout changes, and the continuity changes. And I can't find anything, because when I'm trying to use the help system already built in, the help system doesn't recognize the words which are actually in the pull down menus. So I'm lost. You know, Freddie will tell you he's lost on many things. And actually, where we exist in these areas of grey, and we're very good at doing certain things, other things we're not particularly good at. So I put down a few calls that I think are very much needed in terms of making sure we have got free connectivity to get people there. You know, every home really does need to be connected in the UK. It's a real failure. High-speed broadband would have made, instead of me delivering the radios when the over 70s got shielded and locked down, I would have been able to pop a tablet through and make sure if they didn't have connectivity, their neighbours would be able to share their Wi-Fi with them. But because of our poor Wi-Fi system and the inability of people to move where they were in terms of their location, but also businesses to be able to accommodate that, because BT will tell me very clearly, Ofcom will not allow me to have a statutory service in this location, or a static service, because you need one, because you will have to move to be in a business rather than a residential address, and you will never be able to change back. Well, that's no good. It's, you know, we can't do anything for you for at least 14 days. Why? I used to be visiting Ukraine on a weekly basis. My wife would not pay the bill, would ring up and say, here's my 20 hryvnia, a lot cheaper within Ukraine, and everything would be turned on in 5 minutes. There's no problem with this. It can be done. You know, this is about cooling off periods, apparently, to protect me. I was asked, or one of the points which was made to me about what would help wavelengths, what can people do to help. I think the design is really important. Cracking the myth of World Wide Web accessibility standards, I think, is very important. Widening the remit of Ofcom, making sure that they include more people who, and their reports are accurate and include the groups of people we know who have been excluded, needs to happen. I would like to be able to give voice to those who are not included, and the digital divide which we have needs to become one where people who are not even necessarily going to be digitally included have a right to be within that sphere and have a say about what's happening. So non-digital services are maintained. So giving a voice to the voiceless, I think, is very important. I think in some ways there's probably members of the Guild of IT here, and I would say that's one body which I think wavelengths would be would actually be very beneficial as being a member of, and that's something which I would ask to put forward. But I think, please don't start to build policy without people and presume that, you know, good enough, the 8%, 20% rule is good for everybody, because it isn't. You're abandoning 20% of our population. And I think the figure I've given you around just cognitive impairment, that difference where people are processing in a different way, does give you cause to pause and think, is that why we're having difficulty getting this very stubborn group of people online? Is it because we're not accommodating them in the right way? Is it because the training is not right? Is it because actually we should be looking for support services? Is it because we need to make the interfaces people are using? I just go back to my grumbles and pet hates. One of the things which really annoys me when I start to communicate with a bank and point out how stupid their online systems are, is the fact they say, well, we're trying to do this because it's because of your security. Well, actually, it's because they don't want to lose money, because they don't want people be taken in a fall committed. And then they think by repeating a system which defaults really to a sequence of information, whether it be letters or digits or special symbols as they have now, an uppercase and lowercase, and then puts you through the same thing, whether it be for an email or sends you a code to put in, means it's any safer. Well, it's exactly the same syndrome they're going through, that they come back to using something which is sequential and digit orientated. And for somebody like me who doesn't work around sequences or remember sequences, that's just frustrating. So if I'm asked to pick the third letter out of a word that I happen to pick by random because I've been forced to pick it 10 years ago, or asked to give the end of an email address when I've got maybe have 20 different email addresses, I go through them very quickly because being listed as a CEO and a director and a company secretary of different things, plus being internationally vetted around banking transactions, my emails just get scammed all the time. So I change them. Being able to ask to find these afterwards and use them as a way of identifying myself, it's just a nightmare. And I think it's to everybody, and not expecting me not to write them down. It's also a little bit ludicrous, because I think everybody probably does at the end of the day write them down. But still, even if I had, I can find them because of the visual processing and the auditory processing difficulties I have. Being able to pick them out and not getting mixed up is very difficult for me. So it goes back to, I just can't understand how people can be so anally fixated that the only way they're going to create security is by a sequential set of codes. And if they can't, if that's not good enough, they're going to add the same thing, but they're going to do it to 2 levels. And if that's not good, they'll do 3 levels. And eventually, that's not going to be good enough, so they're going to do 4 levels. And perhaps they should be changing their approach and trying to use this as a way of securing things for people. Though it all goes into factors which will push people offline. It all goes into factors why people are finding it difficult. And it means that if those are areas, if you want feedback on this, and the only way you're going to gather that feedback is through an online channel of written complaint, and you've got to be able to log in to send those complaints to your portal, you're not going to hear from somebody like me. If there isn't a telephone number on a website I can use, so, and, you know, one of the things which I find highly discriminatory is that there's a low portion of people who happen to have hearing impairments than myself. So I prefer always to make a phone call, or I prefer to have video over internet to actually talk to somebody, because I can see what's going on. I can read their expression. I can see people. I feel far more comfortable, and it helps when, particularly, I'm not getting a good phone signal. So auditory, I can see people, and I can link up, and I can have a conversation. And I'd love to be able to use the facilities that, say, Barclays provides for people who are deaf, so they can have sign language interpretation. I can't, because the company who provides that won't deal with me, because I happen to not be deaf. I happen to be dyslexic. But that would give me the portal I needed to be able to communicate. And the irony is, as I said, there's 10 to 18% of our population are like me, to varying extents, different levels of severities, and would really benefit from that. And it could save banking a lot of money and a lot of problems, and nip a lot of the issues in the bud which have been caused by putting everything through a written form on a website and through portals of identification. But we don't do it because the impairment's incorrect. And the community which has been catered for, who I defend to the hill, by the way, this is not criticism of the visually impaired or the deafened communities. They should get the services, just everybody else should, who needs them as well. Is there's such a small proportion opposed to where I am that you can't make an argument that it's more democratic to do that than to provide for myself. So these are all things I think need to be sort of factored in, thought about, and the overall impact in terms of, started to talk about how loneliness was created. One of the biggest creations of loneliness is what we call triggers. And those are situational pressures we all experience. And it could be we're struggling to sell houses, we're worried about a mortgage, we've got financial worries. It could be we feel, disabled people have two triggers. One is they feel very discriminated against because they are being discriminated against, and then they find the access to address those issues is not within their sphere. So you're probably not aware that you, in terms of pursuing that to a point where you can get some recompense for it, could be particularly difficult for a disabled person. So we have now become part of the Equalities Act. And unfortunately, the Equalities Commission are not really doing much around disabled people. Definitely not around cognitive impairment. And again, being able to raise a case is very difficult because it's got to be done in writing rather than verbally. So you hit these quandaries in terms of what do I do? Because legally, I have to put my case in writing. Legally, I have to pay for that legal challenge. The law doesn't protect. Actually, our Equalities Act legislates how people can be discriminated against, which then leads me to start to talk about things like the UN Charter on people with disabilities. And one thing this group should be very aware of moving forward is it gives a very good definition of technologies and how those technologies can be used, and how you should see universal design, which is probably one of the biggest red herrings there. Lots of design will exclude other people. So it's always the dominant groups who get the design in terms of what we need. And I'm not saying we shouldn't design things for the majority, it's just you need to make sure the minorities are also included within there. And the other thing which you should be aware of, and I think I will round up on this, is that within the Charter, there is the right for disabled people to choose the way they are communicated with and the way they communicate, to participate culturally, socially and economically and educationally and in every other way within society. What a lot of the movement of services online has done has excluded them because those rights of communication have been taken away. And that's why I do not believe in the World Wide Web accessibility standards, because they do not accommodate and they do not defend the right for people to be engaged and part of society. And that isn't a criticism of the technology, that's a criticism of the design and the drives and the safeguards and the regulations which are put there. And I would reflect actually standing in a meeting with the Department of Biz and one of the senior executives from Microsoft talking about accessibility. And this guy was American, and he just said, you know, your problem is that your legislation, A, has no teeth, and B, it's not being enforced. When we went to a situation that we had to enforce this and we had to comply, suddenly, you know, there wasn't need for sign language interpretation. There wasn't an argument about whether we were going to do subtitles on films. Everything used to have it because it had to be done. And that has revolutionized us. You know, if you buy a DVD, it will be interpreted. There will be subtitles on it. If you watch Netflix, it's got it. It's got different languages. It will be dubbed as well. And the what I would say is the saving grace is actually digital has got so many other elements to allow people to access and participate in it. We need to utilize them and not just keep on defaulting to the fact that we think it's easier to have everything in writing. So we need to become less text-based. We need to become far more inclusive. We need to start giving people who are not participating a voice and trying to include them in the design and participate within the culture as we go forward. Because that is what will strengthen UK PLC, what will cut out taxes as businesses, as charities, as individual taxpayers, and support people so we can all thrive. And it's about not having an 80% rule. It's about having a 100% rule and saying everybody's got a right to participate. There just may be other ways that people need to channel to find the way from the outside of the hub into the centre, down a particular spoke, so we can actually all meet where we need to in the centre of the wheel, and look at that sort of approach. That there's many ways of coming to where we need to go. So I'm going to leave it there. It's been a sort of overview. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's allowed you to start to think about some of the things which might not be so obvious or you haven't thought about before. And in many ways, I hope it's been challenging and stimulating to move you forward. And if you don't agree with it, that's great. Let's have the debate. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I find it very difficult to well.
Yeah, so thank you, Tim.